Good evening. This is, it is Tuesday, February 11th. This is a regular meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission. So welcome. I want to start with some public comment if we, okay. Well, we reserve 10 minutes at the beginning of our meetings for public comment, so it doesn't look like we've got anybody here to speak today. So I will, we're gonna have a work session on the clear and objective update tonight. And so I think most of you should know where we left off before trees. So we're gonna go through and I'll have Janessa just kind of take over. But we're gonna start with we're gonna start where we left off and then we're gonna move back to trees. So I will go ahead and, is there anything else I should mention before I hand it over to you? Okay.
I can jump in.
Perfect. Jump on in.
So for anybody watching that doesn't know, I'm Janessa Dragovich. I'm a senior planner with the Building and Permit Services Division, and I am the project manager for the Clear and Objective project update. And to my left is Alyssa Hansen, planning director, and to my right is City Attorney's Office, Lauren Summers. So did I say it right? Right? Okay. And so if you remember last time we talked about trees and there were three other remaining items that council had, just kind of flagged that because they didn't have unanimous support the first time around when we went through all of the proposed code changes. And so for efficiency tonight, I kind of thought we would maybe start with those other three remaining items and work through those because I think that those are kind of a little more bookkeeping and we can move through those faster and then reserve the remaining time to go through the changes to the tree language that I put in since you saw it on the 27th, which I sent out the revised packet Saturday. So hopefully some or all of you have had a chance to review that. But I'll basically, once we get to that, I'll walk through each of the changes since then and then explain what happened and why, and then we can go back around to see what we need to discuss further.
I just wanted to make a note that there wasn't an announcement of this meeting.
There was an issue with the agenda. The agenda was basically just a one-sheet agenda that was referring back to the January 27th packet. There wasn't new material submitted on that.
I never saw any mail about it, and I assume other people didn't as well.
And it didn't. We thought it had been posted, and it hadn't been posted to the website. Correct.
It hadn't been mailed out either. That there was a new agenda.
Okay.
The last meeting I have is for the 27th.
Correct, right. And apologies for that, and we're figuring out what went wrong and trying to address that so that that doesn't happen again. So any other questions before I kind of start with the first of the remaining issues? Okay. So the items to revisit, this is up here. As I said, we'll go through the first three as kind of housekeeping, and then we'll get back to the tree preservation issues. So we'll first go through the 300-foot ridgeline setback, then the 20% grading prohibition, and then the PUD 1-acre open space issue. So on the 300-foot ridgeline setback, this one received a mixed straw poll vote. Currently, PUDs in the South Hills have a requirement for a 300-foot setback from the urban growth boundary, or UGB. Its origin and intent appear to come from the South Hills study, though it does not implement any particular policy directly. From what we can gather, the original intent, remembering that the South Hills study is from the 1970s, was to ensure that sections of the ridgeline weren't developed in case they were needed for the ridgeline trail system. That said, the actual ridgeline isn't easily identified or mapped, especially in a clear and objective way. And so the UGB was used instead as a proxy, and it doesn't match the ridgeline exactly. So according to Parks and Open Space, there's no land within the urban growth boundary currently identified for acquisition for the ridgeline trail system. So when we talked about this before, we talked about some of that kind of mismatch between, it's not directly implementing a policy, the fact that the ridgeline is just a proxy, it's not an accurate estimate or indicator of the ridgeline, and the fact that the purpose was to save a place so that we could acquire parkland, but we've already acquired it. And so we kind of talked a lot about that, and there was a little bit of lack of clarity around the origin and intent, and so concerns kind of about wanting more information on that, and about whether the setback was effective or relevant. If you recall, we did a straw poll for an alternative option, which was to remove the criterion completely. That actually technically got majority support. There were 4 commissioners out of the 7 at that time who voted to remove it completely. 1 commissioner didn't agree with that, and then 2 commissioners wanted more information, wanted staff to take another stab at trying to find the origin and intent. So since then, we did conduct more research, and unfortunately, we're not able to obtain any additional insight beyond what we originally came to see as our best guess at where this came from. So given that the criterion doesn't implement the South Hill study policy directly, staff is comfortable with either of 2 options. One would be to remove the criterion altogether in recognition that the original intent is no longer relevant given the completion of the Ridgeline Trail system. This may be a good example of how there isn't really a process built into the code to sunset or revisit regulations that are no longer necessary. Also, this is an overlapping requirement as we have other criteria that also address preservation of the ridgeline. So that's one option. The other option is to move forward with the draft code language as proposed by staff originally. Those proposed changes implement the approved concept by reducing the setbacks applicability to only areas over 900 feet elevation, which is more likely where you would have ridgeline corresponding with the urban growth boundary up there. And then you could wait to assess additional input during the public comment periods that are coming in terms of determining whether you want to pull it completely at that point or make a different adjustment. So that's kind of option 1 or option 2.
All right. So questions or comments from commissioners? We basically have 2 options before us. I realize that Commissioner Beeson wasn't with us for that. Those original straw polls. So I guess I would ask if there are, let's see. So I know that, previously there were 4, and I recall being included in that as well. There were 4 of us that were comfortable, just as Janessa mentioned, because of it didn't seem like it was even a relevant criteria any longer. So there were a number of us that were comfortable with the removal of that altogether, but we did straw poll with the language that staff had recommended. So I guess my question to all of you is that, do you feel that you want to have a discussion about those 2 options as far as changing course from what we originally had done? And Commissioner Beeson, I'm kind of looking to you because this would be something you would be included in this time around.
Yeah, if it helps. I went through the material, and I guess as Janessa's talked about it now, it doesn't appear there's any need for it. I mean, that seems pretty clear from the material and from the discussion. So I would, I guess, go with the 4 who, in the straw poll who voted to remove the criteria. I think, if nothing else, if it's not needed and really isn't relevant anymore, it's kind of good to reduce the size of the code.
Okay.
So I'll start it out that way.
Okay. Do any other commissioners have comments on Commissioner Ramey? And then I'll go to Commissioner Baker.
So I think I'm in the same camp. I did want to just clarify. You said there were other parts of the code that protect the ridgeline. So what I hope I heard you mean, or what I think I heard you mean was, no, wait a minute, that's not right. Anyway. Wow, long day. Protect the visual nature of the ridge is what I'm looking at. So I'm presuming there are other aspects of the code that do that, including the tree preservation, correct?
Right. This does tie into why we've been treating tree preservation at or above 900 feet elevation a little bit differently. It's partly that gets at some of that higher view shed impact and being a little extra.
So then I'm completely okay with removing it completely.
Okay. Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I'm in favor of the proposed code language that would leave it in for the public hearing. The main reason for that is the goal is to get the view shed, even though the land may not, they've acquired whatever land they think they want for the time being. But you still would like to make sure you protect that view shed so that you don't have property sticking up out of it above 900 feet. And I think by leaving that in, we let the public comment. This is closer to what the whole process, the original and rather intensive process where we developed these changes. This is closer to the language than removing it. Removing it wasn't on the table. So I think at this point I would be more comfortable with the proposed language for that reason. Again, we're trying to go along with the process that was, there's a lot of community input in this process, and you want to, make certain that they feel like their input was valued.
So I would say that, this commission did support, the language that was recommended by staff. And when it went to council, because it wasn't unanimous, that's why they wanted us to look at it again, just to take a closer look. And there were a couple of commissioners that had questions. I don't believe either of them are here as well. So,
One.
okay. I couldn't remember who it was. I apologize. Okay, so, basically those would be the two options, would be to go with the staff's recommendation to reduce that or to remove it altogether. And so I think that, I'd be interested in hearing, it sounds like there's at least two that would support removing it altogether. I would include myself in that. So maybe we should just go ahead and straw poll removing it from the code well, let's just start with that. So why don't I go ahead and just get a straw poll of those who would support removing it from. Okay, so we've got 4. So I would say that we'll go ahead and move forward with that. And make note that the commission.
Note that I would.
And yes, and then certainly. So 4 and then 1 opposed.
Thank you. By the way, thank you for, sorry. That's okay. I spoke.
Oh, please.
Thank you for providing, it was really clear. It was great. So it was great just to provide that context. I appreciate it.
Sure.
And yeah, I'm a little distracted. Do we want to make sure?
Yes, I just want to make sure, this is the meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission, so I just want to make sure.
Sorry, yep, I'm listening in now.
Oh,
It's city council meetings listening and this needs to be.
Great, okay.
perfect.
No interest other than I'm unemployed and
Okay, well, welcome. We love an audience. Okay, so,
Okay.
moving on,
So
right?
moving on to the 20% grading prohibition. So this item relates to the removal of the 20% grading prohibition. 6 commissioners supported the proposed amendment. 1 commissioner was neutral, given concerns around adopting the landslide hazard map in connection to proposed geotechnical requirement changes. So there's a strict prohibition on grading on any slope that is 20% or greater if you're under the clear and objective track. And so this was one of the kind of barriers that we were trying to remove by addressing 20% slopes as a risk under the geotechnical assessment, and by adopting one part of the DGAMI, the Department of Gravel and Mineral Industries? Geologic Industries.
Gravel.
Sorry. I've got the mines in my head.
I have the right idea.
Close, so close. So they released a new study of our area, of our metro area, for deep and shallow landslide hazards. And so part of our proposal was to adopt a static version of the deep landslide susceptibility. And the reason being because those are not risk factors that are readily evident. It's not related to shallow things that are like springs and seeps on your property or the type of soil. These are things that really, a study like this has to reveal the risk factor. So the hang up and why one of the commissioners the first time around was neutral on it was because there was a little confusion around whether the adoption of that map would render any properties unbuildable. And so we clarified with council and then clarified again in here to just make it abundantly clear, this does not mean that there's any property that we are rendering unbuildable. It just means that it's identifying an existing risk factor and ensuring that the geotechnical report will address that risk factor. So given that, I think that this is just another opportunity because it was flagged by council just as a not unanimous straw poll result. This is the opportunity to say, do we want to discuss this anymore, or do we want to let the original straw poll hold and move forward?
Okay, Commissioner Baker and then Commissioner Beeson.
Yeah, I was uncomfortable with this because Dogami considers 25% the slope you should, that's reasonable to build on, and our buildable lands inventory has 30% slopes. So I'm comfortable if we just change the language to 25%. And that way, on the steeper slopes, we would follow the state guidelines for clear and objective. Obviously, on the non-clear and objective path, you could do whatever you want, But on this clear and objective path, I think that would be a good position to consider as well.
I just want to, can I respond
Yep,
to that a little bit?
absolutely.
Just for a little added clarification. We talked a lot about the 20% that we had in code versus the 25% that the Dogami or state references versus the 30% that our BLI recognizes as the cutoff. That's not necessarily something that we're changing here, and the preferred concept was to remove this particular prohibition and on grading and to address it through geotechnical. So I just want to comment that that's kind of taking us out of where we've already been down this path and preferred concept and approval and whatnot. And I don't want us to get too bogged down in that this was just a confusion over the map and buildable lots. So
the question before the commission tonight is whether or not anyone feels that there's new information that would lead us to changing how we voted when this came to council the first time. So if there is information that would change the course of that direction, which was to remove that, I personally, I don't have any new information, so I would be voting to just stay with the original outcome. And so that's probably, unless, Commissioner Beeson, you had another comment, so I'll go ahead and.
Well, I was just going to say, I support the removal of the prohibition, and I guess my understanding of that, as I read the material and listened to the explanation, what we'd be then relying on as development goes forward, there would be geotechnical analysis specific to subdivision or a PUD or whatever that would address any geotechnical issue. So I think I support where I guess this was before on the 6-to-1 straw vote, I'd be in with the 6.
Okay. So any other comments? So then, Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, it was just, so since the original discussion, you've got a new map from Dogami, is that correct?
no. This is the same exact map that we proposed at the time. It's recently adopted by, or been published by Dogami, instead of recently being in the last year. But this is the same thing that you saw the last time I was here.
So where do we include that in the code?
So under the proposed changes under the geotechnical is where it talks about the map and refers to the adopted map that we would need to adopt as part of the code amendment package.
And do you happen to have a sample of what this looks like? So we
Right there. That's it. So there's high risk and moderate risk. So the red are the high risk areas and the yellow are the moderate risk. So we would adopt the tax map layer as well. And then we would be able to identify through the land use application if there's any portion of the site that has high or moderate risk, then the geotechnical report would need to specifically address that risk in addition to a number of other more shallow risk factors.
Just, this hadn't been published before, so I was concerned that
Right.
things change sometimes, you know.
No, this is nothing has changed on this.
Right, so I'll go ahead and just straw poll those who would like to stick with the original recommendation. All in favor of that? All right, those opposed? Commissioner Baker, how do you vote?
Oh, no, the existing recommendation is to remove this prohibition, right? And substitute,
The geotechnical requirement with this, and just as a refresher, you, the last time you did vote in support of removal, so.
just, this doesn't say that, that's why I'm concerned. The language here just says remove it, so.
Okay, so do you want to stick with your original position on this?
I'm fine with
You're
it,
okay with that?
as long as it's clear that we are including this in the geotechnical.
That is very clear.
Because we don't see any of that.
Okay. So that would be unanimous, 5.
Great.
All right.
Okay, and the final one is the PUD 1 acre open space requirement. This is an excerpt from the map that we made showing it's really hard to read at this scale without being able to zoom in, but there are hatch marks, one direction that show the proximity radiuses to parks, open space, or public schools, and then there's also hash marks that indicate the PUD overlay areas. And so basically this was one where the preferred concept was to change our existing radius that was requirement that was that new developments, if they weren't within a quarter mile to an existing park and open space, then they would need to provide 1 acre of private open space on site, private common open space on site. And so our proposed recommendation was to increase that radius to a half a mile, which we had talked about. There were some supporting reasons for that, part of which, like the goal for parks and open spaces to have a park within a half a mile to most residences. And then also to set the requirement for when, if they aren't within a half a mile of a park or open space, that they would have a scalable requirement for providing that private common open space on site. And we also set like a 2 acre minimum on the development site before this would kick in, because one of the things that was identified was that this is really prohibitive on smaller infill sites versus larger developments. So again, this was one where one commissioner did not support this approach, and the remaining commissioners all supported it. So it's, again, I ask, do we reopen this for discussion, or are you okay with proceeding with the existing poll results?
Okay, Commissioner Baker?
I made 2 comments in this. Again, I'm generally not in favor of expanding the distance, because 1/4 mile is considered the national standard for how far apart you should be from a park. With small children, you don't usually walk more than 3 or 4 blocks to get to a park. That's just the way it works. Even in New York City or in Portland, that's their goal, is a 1/4 mile. And then I made the point that that it shouldn't be by the way the crow flies, because if you have something in the way, like a railroad track or a freeway, it doesn't matter that you're half a mile. You might be a mile and a half from the park. So that needs to still be added, as I recall, to this, to make it, from my point of view, to make it acceptable. Because there might be places where you have.
So if there just going to ask if there are any other commissioners who who would like to interject any comments about whether or not they feel that they have new information or anything that would indicate them wanting to change the outcome of the commission's original straw poll on this. Okay, so then I'll just go ahead and get a straw poll on this one as well. So those in favor of,
Can I make one other comment?
sure.
See, the way this says it's a straight line, so this is sort of like the crow flies. Well, there may be property in between that you can't cross.
Right.
And again, you know, when we dealt with this with multifamily standards, we made certain that there was wording in there that made certain that you could actually walk there. In other words, not fly in in some contraption, but you could actually get there in a quarter mile or even in a half a mile. So without that, I just think this is poor code. Because, we've discussed this before and it's been included in other places in our code. If you look at the multifamily standards, it's got the same requirement put in there.
If I could respond a little bit, part of the reason that it is how it is the constraints of clear and objective and trying to describe it, and it was already difficult to kind of try to define how you measure. Like under clear and objective, we're even scrutinized on what is the clear and objective measurement. And so it's not necessarily that won't happen, or I'd be happy to work with you as we go forward through the public comment, and if there's a way to try to find a way to word something, or if we want to wait until we hear more public feedback.
Just pull the code from the multifamily standards. It's got the language.
I'm not sure the code reference you're talking about, but I would just put that this is, again, starting point, and we will still get feedback and things that may cause you to
Right. And
evaluate other parts.
It's the ability to reduce the open space on a multifamily project if you're within a quarter of a mile of a park. But it has language in there that says you have to get there. In other words, on, public sidewalks, streets, whatever,
So I would just say that this, again, is a really early part of this whole process. And I think that this is where we're trying to come up with something that can then be put out to the public so that they can weigh in and they can tell us what they would like to see. And I think that this still represents a good, we're looking for a starting point at this point. So I think those are really valid comments. But I do think that if the majority of the commission is still comfortable with what we had recommended the first time around, I think that I just want to gauge everybody's appetite for that. So I'm going to just go ahead and ask for a straw poll. Those who are comfortable with the commission's original decision to change the distance from a quarter mile to a half mile and the other provisions in that. So I'll go ahead and ask for that.
I'm sorry, so you're talking about the whole thing. We're not just at A, subsection A, the whole thing.
Yeah.
You just listed.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yes, the whole thing that we had pretty much, okay. So are you a yes on that as well?
Sure, and I wanted a comment at the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then opposed, Commissioner Baker, okay. And then Commissioner Taylor.
Yeah, I know that I expressed this the first time around. There is reference in the code in terms of quarter mile in reference. I actually think half a mile for the PUD is fine, yet there is some validity just in terms of, the many parts of the code and many different references does a quarter mile. I think you've done a good job describing that. So I just wanted to, I always am hesitant to have commissioners without the code sitting in front of them cite any specific anything, but just on a general note. Where my concern is that I expressed last time, and I think as a starting point, this is great. I'm still concerned about proportion. So 2 acres or larger. So let's say you've got your 2 acre. You've got 10% or essentially an acre or 14,500 square feet, 14,500 square feet. So basically an acre has to be designated to open space. And I guess I still, as we go through the public process, I'd really, where's that coming from? An acre it's quite a lot of open space proportionally. So half of the development site is going to have to be open space. Because if it's 2 acres, right?
It's scalable. The existing requirement requires 1 acre minimum, regardless of the size of the development site. What we're proposing to go to is it wouldn't even kick in unless your development site is 2 acres to begin with, and then it's scalable. And so I believe the first part is like 1/3 of an acre. So if you had a 2 acre site, it would be more like 1/3 of an acre that
Right.
would be the open space.
I understood it, and that's why I said, I see that it's 2 acres is when it's kicking in, that subsection, you get to choose between subsection A and subsection B. So, and I'm sorry if I'm not, I just think it's going to be important to have an explanation in the process, in the public process, about that proportional piece, because when you're reading through it, because you've got a proposed, you've got when it kicks in is 2 acres or larger, must comply, and it's 10% of the development site or 14.5, whichever is greater, and then you go into that if they include, and then you have these nuances. And I think in order for people to understand what that means, this is fairly complicated to be able to be ready to kind of show that. I mean, because this is better illustrated. Because I went through it. I still have some concerns. I think it's just a great starting point. It's fine. So I think having an understanding through the public process, and maybe it won't come up. It's just that's where I look at it, like as a user of the code, when I go through this, does it feel fair and equitable, like in distribution? Of what's the impact if you have a smaller versus larger? What does that look like? What is the actual result of the development? Did we just achieve what we wanted? And that's where I go. Yep. So that's all.
Very good points. Okay. Well, again, I think, this is going to be a really helpful starting point, and we'd hope that we get a lot of feedback from the public and can kind of fine tune it before it goes to council.
Looking for feedback to help right-size it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I had meant to, actually, this particular one, so I'm sorry, I actually meant to go through it and just actually diagram it for myself to kind of look at a fictitious site and look at what that would look like 70 feet, because all of these 1 through 6, not the subsection, each common open space 70 by 70 with a certain amount of frontage. What happens if a site looks different? Then you're sending them to discretionary. But what does that look like in reality in terms of larger land that actually is left, right? So can you actually get access to these PUDs? Is it effective, or do you just push people into discretionary tract much quicker than intended? Yeah.
And the goal with increasing to a half a mile from a
Exactly,
quarter mile, that
which
was
is
a
the better one.
big part,
Yeah,
because
exactly.
that reduces, because there is kind of a philosophical issue kind of hiding behind this one too, is in terms of the need for proximity to parks and open space is very important theoretically, that there's city infrastructure providing those public parks and open space throughout town. So we've got that system, trying to achieve this goal of everything within a half a mile. Then if our development is requiring private property to be taken out of the land pool for building houses on or dwelling units, but because it needs to be used for private common open space that only the people within that one development site have legal access to, there's kind of it's again trying to find that balance between preserving and protecting things and keeping open space or providing extra open space versus providing housing.
Right.
And getting that. And
That's
so
exactly right.
this is the starting point. I fully expect we'll get a lot of feedback on this one because it is one of the more complicated sections. And so that's why I'm not necessarily defending anything yet, and I just think it's at a point that I'm very comfortable going forward and would like to hear a lot of feedback on it.
Yep. I agree.
Any other comments before we move on? All right.
Okay. So back to trees. So before I move on, we had really good discussion last time, and a lot of questions came up. One of the things that I followed up with was finding out a little bit more about Portland's approach, because that had come up, like, what does Portland do? So just a few little notes, and, I'm not an expert on Portland's tree code, but we did get enough information. So they do not have a clear and objective versus a discretionary track. So it's one size fits all for their tree preservation standards. Their minimum preservation standards have different options. So there's kind of 6 different options. Those hinge on the focus being on preserving trees that are over 20 inches in diameter breast height, DBH, and then a total percentage of the total DBH on site. So again, a very similar concept as what we're going with in terms of using DBH. The difference in the options has to do with the more trees over 20 inches that you save, the fewer over DBH overall that you have to save. So it's just kind of you preserve more over 20 inches, then you have to do fewer DBH overall on the site. They have a provision that sites over 1 acre must preserve at least 35% of the total canopy area, which is a little different than what we do. And their applicants can either do a tree inventory, so this is another similarity, where they have kind of the ability to do the accounting method, as I call it, more of a strict inventory, or they can use other methods such as LiDAR to do more of the canopy cover assessment. They allow reductions to minimum density requirements based on tree preservation. So that's very different than what we do. And this is a little bit, some things are similar and comparable, some things are apples to oranges. So they allow that's just different than how our code's set up. Their critical root zone ratio is 1:1, so 1 foot of radius for critical root zone for every 1 inch of diameter breast height. And then they have mitigation options that identify like preservation of smaller trees, which I'll talk about that as we go through the changes. That's something that we did kind of wrap in something to that. They do have a tree fund, so kind of like we talked about the potential mitigation bank. And then they have other options that are consistent, other options. This is almost like the adjustment, similar to our adjustment, but you can explore other options, but you have to show consistency with the purpose of the tree preservation standards. So that just to give a little overview of comparison. And then, so these are 2 images, and I was going to challenge you to tell me which one's Portland and which one's Eugene. So 1
It's like being
or 2? Which one do you, no, I'm kidding. So 1 is Portland. Now, again, you spotted it.
And that's actually what I had heard. I was one of the people that brought it up and said they're doing a really good job of maintaining their urban forests. And some of it is their mitigation.
They have a more robust mitigation. Yeah. They have funds. They also may have a more aggressive street tree program. There's a lot of factors that make it hard to do an exact comparison of why or what's different. But yes, that's Eugene. The other thing I was going to say is that, like, this one, you can clearly see there's some older trees in here, and this is probably an older part of Portland versus I tried to give you something that would have some newer development as well. Yeah. So just for information. So next, I'm going to switch over to, I'll come out of the PowerPoint and pull up the code provisions. And then I thought I would just kind of walk through the entire packet before we start discussing anything. Again, with time permitting, I don't want to get bogged down on a discussion early on without having gone through all of the changes. And hopefully you had a chance to read. I did try to build in more narrative so that you could kind of walk through and see what we did.
And I'll just chime in. If you have a comment, I'll just go ahead and start a queue, and then we'll kind of go around at the end when everybody. So I would say just save your comments for I'm looking for a pen, but save your comments and then we'll go through it.
And I will, Commissioner Ramey, you had sent me an email, and I will address some of your questions as we go along as well. I did get that. So I provided a few more definitions and for context, and the critical root zone definition. This is something that had come up a little bit in discussion last time around critical root zone and the impact of, because if they're protecting the critical root zone, that has a impact on the amount of buildable area there is on a newly created lot. So one of the things that had come up several times through the public comment period, but we hadn't necessarily wanted to go there because the critical root zone it's embedded kind of in a couple different definitions. So we've got the definition for critical root zone that sets up that it's the area around a tree that has a radius of 18 inches times the diameter breast height, expressed in inches. And so that's the 1 to 1.5 ratio. And then in addition to that, under the definition for tree removal, that's where the 30% impact that they're limited to comes from. So basically, I did some more checking. I talked to, we have an arborist on my staff in the land use section, as well as I talked to the urban forester, and there's support for moving to the 1-to-1 critical root zone ratio. In fact, the urban forester said that the 1.5 to 1 is a conservative number and definitely not necessarily specific, or, there's times when people do stuff and then within that radius and don't even find any roots. So he was cautiously optimistic that implementing the 1-to-1, at least for clear and objective, would be possibly a better fit. So I would say that I felt good about the support that I heard from 2 arborists and city staff on that. And in doing that, because if we're reducing the critical root zone, then the 30% impact allowance on the critical root zone may be too much. So we also propose adjusting the definition for the tree removal to reflect a 15% impact threshold for tree removal. So kind of a proportionately reduced impact allowance based on the reduction in the critical root zone. And this, we didn't try to write the language into here. That I felt like I could explain the direction, and if you support implementing a smaller critical root zone, we'll work with the city attorney's office to make sure that there's a good way to add that language.
Janessa, so just a procedural question, so we won't see that again before it would go to public hearing? Okay.
That's my intention, is that I feel like what we're saying we're doing is clear enough. That's not going to change, and so if your comfort level is such, I don't feel like it necessarily needs to come back for another review for a definition change. And this is a good time to also point out that this set of changes, because of the time and trying to craft them between our 2 meetings in a 2-week period, city attorney's office hasn't had full chance to vet all of the changes. So we're still going to work through, and there may be minor changes to wording or something on that, which again, this is still a fluid process because we may be changing based on public comment as well as we go forward. Those are the only 2 significant things within the definition section that was proposed. Then I added in the purpose statement, the purpose section from the tree section. That was Commissioner Beeson had mentioned that was helpful when you were reviewing the draft language, and I thought that was a good idea, and so I wanted to put it in here so that you have it in one place. Then this next, under the first part of subsection 2, under the preservation standards, Commissioner Taylor, you had pointed out that these are in the general section of we call it the 9/6000s, that apply to all development. And just to add clarity that these are only applicable to the clear and objective tracts, I added a sentence here, and these are the code references for each of the clear and objective tracts. So it just to take out any question and make it clear that this is applicable to clear and objective land use application reviews. Then the next change, I'm going to scroll down. I did not change the 20,000 square foot number that we talked about as far as an exemption. I did change it to, I think we had some different language around, and I changed it to as under 20,000 square feet. So to be clear, 20,000 square foot lot would not get the exemption, but anything under 20,000 square feet would, as it's written now. We had an awesome GIS person who put together a link. I don't know if everybody had a chance to kind of explore that. I could pull it up here, but it's really hard to see on this screen. But that link, if you want to take a look at that, and it has the tables that give you the number of lots and the acres that would be exempted based on those three things. So that when we come back, that's something that I would like guidance from you tonight on whether to start it at 10,000, 15,000, or 20,000. And see what our right size starting point is. The other thing that I want to point out about this link is that this is using the buildable lands inventory that was done in 2012. So it's not been cleaned up to remove things that have since developed. So that's going to be, those numbers are bigger than what the actual impact would be on those numbers. So just that caveat too. Oh, and you can see within the South Hills area or without. So that's the other distinction is that I'd like tonight is which number do we want to start with, and do you want it the exemption to apply only outside of the South Hills area or even within the South Hills area? So the next change was under subsection 3 was added to, and this was based on discussions around balancing housing and tree preservation. And so we've talked a lot several times throughout about how multifamily developments in particular, the higher density developments, one, there's landscape requirements that come into play that require tree planting, including like perimeter parking landscaping, minimum landscaping, and then sometimes buffers. And so we put this in there for you to consider whether we want to expand an exemption that would apply to R3, R4, or the 2 commercial zones that allow multifamily as a possible way to refine where these would apply. Those are likely ones that those developments would be able to make an adjustment review argument to get to full mitigation, and then within the adjustment review be able to count their landscaping requirements towards meeting that. And so we kind of, as we were exploring the adjustment review option, we were kind of getting to this point of it begs the question of whether there should just be an outright exemption. So then I think that's everything I said. Oh, and then also none of these zones that are proposed here, R3, R4, or C2 or C3, are applied to properties above 900 feet. So in case that's a concern, that still keeps our 900-foot and above area dealt with a little differently. Then the next change, we rearranged this table and added a maximum mitigation column so that it kind of, you get to see everything in one place. Seemed a little easier to understand the table and the concept of the mitigation. This language up here was changed to call out the adjustment review option, or to make it so that you can adjust this section. And we also changed from the conversation, and again, this could be a starting point that if you want to adjust this number. Originally last week, this was proposed at 60% with zero mitigation, and so there were concerns about even over 900 feet needing a little more flexibility, and so I dropped this starting point down to 50%, and then we added up to 10% mitigation through the adjustment review process. So it's still keeping a tighter preservation if they want to meet the development standards outright, but there is a little more flexibility that can be gained through an adjustment. And again, that 10% is something that you'll probably hear about, or if you want to adjust that starting point, that's fine too. The next section was under the tree removal or preservation and removal plan option. So this is another one where I went back to staff who actually implement the requirements after the land use application goes through. And so in talking to staff, they felt pretty adamant that the name of and name of species of the tree is important information. One of the things that came up is that a lot of times, the DBH is a snapshot in time of what size that tree was. And we talked a little bit before about if you've got a cluster of trees and they're close together, when you're trying to truth it on site and figure out which tree was actually intended to be preserved versus which one could be cut, having that extra information can be helpful in making sure that we're implementing the approved plan. So just that would be staff preference, would be to keep the requirement for common name, genus, and species under the tree, under this method. And I would point out that under the tree preservation area, we're not requiring the types of trees and species. We're not requiring that detailed information. Then the next change, we added currently, so this was another thing that kind of came up. The location of all existing and proposed development on the site was kind of a stumbling block. What does that mean? Does that, for a subdivision, we don't know where the houses are going to be. And so by putting it in currently there, as Alyssa had kind of tried to clarify last time, we're meaning what's currently proposed. So if it's a site review and there's, or a conditional use permit and there's buildings involved, then those are proposed as part of the development. If it's a subdivision, what's proposed are the streets and the sidewalks and the utilities, and that's development. And development is a defined term, and so we're hoping that the adding currently gives enough distinction around that to make it clear we're not meaning future house locations. Then the next change, so this one we had, because of the change to the table and the mitigation requirements and the adjustment review, we had to kind of rework this section a little bit. Excuse me. So section A was just added to reference to the maximum mitigation within the table. Section B was amended to clarify the time frame for replanting and to clarify the maintenance of the replacement trees is an ongoing responsibility for the property owner. Excuse me. So we had talked about this, and we talked about maybe like a 5-year window on taking care of the plant. What we kind of came around to was it's really an ongoing issue. It's not something that we don't want to create an unintended loophole, so to speak, where if you say a 5-year window and in 5 years that tree's not 8 inches in DBH, then is it no longer, can we not enforce on it if it gets just removed at that point because the 5-year time went by? So the idea is that this would be an ongoing expectation that a tree that was mitigated, so you didn't have to preserve something, you used a mitigation allowance, the intention is still that a tree was planted and that it will stay. Then as far as the time limit, we added within 1 year from the date of removal or prior to final occupancy, and the reason we put 2 things in there is because sometimes we have things that are removed as part of the development process and they come in for a building permit, and we can identify that for say a new house on a lot that had a mitigation tree, that house could take a couple years to build. It's not always within a year. And so by allowing it to be prior to the final occupancy, the hope is that then we can be flexible in terms of when the tree goes in. Most builders say that the trees are about the last thing that goes in, so the landscaping. So that was why we wanted to tie it to the final occupancy. But if on the other side, there may be mitigation trees that get removed outside of a permit process, in which case the 1 year date from the date of removal would apply. Then scroll through our list. Trees. We're getting close. So the tree preservation area alternative, again, I left it so far at the 50%. That's something that was discussed a lot on the 27th, and I would like a little more clarity tonight around whether 50% is the right starting point, or if you want to choose a different percentage preservation. Also, subsection B was changed so that mitigation is not allowed except as approved through an adjustment review. So it opens it up for a little flexibility through the adjustment process. The other thing that we changed was originally we were requiring that the entire critical root zone would be included in the preservation area. Again, we're kind of relying on the design professional to certify that the amount of DBH will actually be preserved based on the tree preservation area identified. And so we kind of stepped back from requiring the critical root zones to be entirely within that, because that does require extra accounting, so to speak, and this is supposed to kind of move us away from that. So that's that change, just to add greater flexibility. And then we didn't change a lot in the last part. We did add a note here, and we added one additional note just to distinguish, because we've got trees removed that are designated for mitigation versus trees that were designated for preservation that sometimes have to be removed because they become dead, diseased, dying, or hazardous. And so it's just a little duplicative language, but it's because it's two different types of trees, preservation versus mitigation. Then there were questions as to why we require a certified arborist and not a landscape architect at this point. And so again, I checked with our urban forestry, I checked with our arborist on staff, and the idea was that after the fact, you're dealing with a little bit different issues. They're really more specific to the tree, whether it can handle increased impact if you're going to change the location of the protective fencing from what the city is recommending, or if it does need to have that dead, diseased, dying, or hazardous. That's the hazardous tree identification. There's a certification that's involved that typically arborists have. I'm not sure that it's common for landscape architects. So our preference is to leave it as it is. And if we hear different feedback from the design community or others as we go forward, we could reevaluate it at that point. But we feel good that there's justification for it being an arborist at this point. And so then this was the existing reference to adjustments. So this is just strike through now because we embedded the ability to adjust within the specific sections where they're adjustable. Then I provided the old adjustment review criteria. Since we're striking out the entire original section, we wanted to kind of just try to you use these as a guide still, but for your review purposes, we thought it would be better to just show you the old one and strike out, and then go through the new proposed ones. And again, reminder that this is fresh adjustment review language. This will need to be refined, and hopefully we'll get some more feedback as we go through. But to start with, the basic idea is that it allows reduction to the minimum preservation. Note that staff can use discretion in the adjustment review process in determining whether or not they've met the criteria. So, and whether or not they've successfully demonstrated that the additional or the reduced preservation is necessary. It incorporates criteria similar to those of the discretionary tracts in terms of, this is a big chunk of text, but what it's really doing is kind of setting up the highest priority for preservation and the characteristics that we want to focus on. Then it allows up to 100% mitigation. So there was a lot of talk about, up to full mitigation. However, they would need to make the argument. So by allowing that within the adjustment review, it does allow us to use some discretion on evaluating that request. It would allow up to 10% mitigation at or above 900 feet elevation and up to 10% mitigation for the tree preservation area alternative, to add a little flexibility, but stay with the idea behind the concept, which was you're dedicating kind of a chunk to preservation.
Okay.
So that's the walkthrough. I'll go ahead and scroll way back up to the beginning, and we can see if there's any discussion needed.
So
Fine tuning.
let me just start off here. So Janessa, you're looking for some very specific direction with regards to a couple of things: the critical root zone ratio, the starting point for the development site being 10, 15, or
Size.
20,000. I just want to make sure I'm getting all these, because I definitely want to make sure that we touch on those.
We could walk back through if you want me to
Okay.
walk, and I can point out the kind of decision points that I need, that I
Okay.
more clear.
Let's do that, and let's
Guidance.
just take one by one, and then we'll have commissioners can chime in, and
Perfect.
we'll go with that. And then if there are other pieces of it that you all would like to weigh in on, that, maybe weren't specific, maybe they were addressed as a recommendation here, but not something that Janessa was specifically looking for our guidance on. So we can just go back and do that. So I did have Commissioner Baker in the queue early on. Did you have a comment on the first section, or do you want to hold off?
It's actually on the first two. I also spoke with the forester, and he was comfortable with reducing the CRZ as long as you also reduced
The impact.
the impact.
Impact.
In other words,
15.
he wasn't in favor of the CRZ.
They go together.
If you left the 30%.
Right.
He was comfortable with 15%.
Okay.
And then I'll comment on the next section.
So that does bring up the first one is basically, do you want us to implement the 1-to-1 ratio and reduced impact? So those go together. So it would be 1-to-1, CRZ would be 1-to-1 with 15% as the threshold for impact.
Okay.
I just have a
Commissioner Halen.
curiosity about, what does PDX Portland do? Is their impact, because they have the 1-to-1 ratio, is their impact 15%? Just out of curiosity.
It's similar. They have a different way of approaching because they consider existing impacts to the critical root zone in addition to new impacts to the critical root zone. So they do 1-to-1, and then it's 25% impact, but that's existing impact and and possible impact. So I think that 15%, considering considering it's 15% based on the development that's proposed, feels like a similar ratio to me.
So I'm sorry, can you explain that? So existing,
So if you had a tree and
Yeah.
you have, let's say
existing
it's a
structure.
30-inch tree and you have a 30-foot radius, and the radius critical root zone, and then you have existing structures within that 30-foot radius, you would have to calculate that percentage of impact on that's just from something that's already there into your 25% total allowable impact.
yeah. Okay, thanks.
Commissioner
So
Ramey.
that was one of my questions about the critical root zone was, well, where did these numbers come from? So now we've heard they came from Portland, and several references think the 1-to-1 is okay. So
Yes.
I'm okay then also.
Anyone else? I also will just chime in and say, again, this is a starting point, so I think that we haven't heard from our community on this, but I know a lot of work research went into kind of pulling this all together, so unless I'm convinced otherwise, I am definitely supportive of this particular. Go ahead. Yes, this particular piece.
Sorry, my hand went up.
That's okay.
That was like a nonverbal interruption.
take
Sorry about that. Yeah, me too. I appreciate, I think, staff, you were super responsive. And I think you've done a great job of kind of creatively looking at some of at the feedback. And I think some of these sections, obviously where they get a little bit more complicated to make sure, have we achieved? And it's really, you described it really well. The last time when we were talking about the open space requirement is, have we achieved the balance we want? So really that's what I look at. So because I feel like I want to spend more time with it myself, when we got this and actually being able to kind of really absorb it, mentally understand it, is so I feel really good about generally, I definitely support this first piece. And then obviously letting the process unfold, continue to unfold. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so would it help to do a straw poll on just this one piece? Okay, so I'll go ahead and ask the commissioners to raise your hand if you are in support of the 1-to-1 ratio and the 15% allowable reduction of allowable impact. All right, so all those in favor? We have 5. Any opposed? Okay, there's that.
Okay, so the next clarification. Let's see. Let's go to that one. Does anybody have any concerns over the language that just clarifies that it's only applicable to clear and objective applications? If we want to do a.
Where are we at? Where are you talking?
Where's that?
It's,
H2.
thank you.
H2.
Bottom of page 2.
Oh, yes. Okay. Anybody have any concerns with that? So we're good with the recommendation here?
Okay. Then, so the next step would be looking at that exception, or the exemption. So whether you want to leave it as is, open it up for public comment with this as a starting point, or whether you want to adjust that to 15,000 or 10,000 square feet for the threshold, and in or out of the South Hills study. So there's kind of a couple different possibilities there.
Commissioner Beeson.
I guess just kind of a question on process. We're going to go through this tonight. We're going to give you feedback. You're going to kind of redo this. It's going to head into a public process, and there'll be public hearing. It's going to circle back to us. So on a question like this specifically, if we were to, whether it's 20,000 or 15,000 or 10,000, is some of this kind of the choices on this or the possibilities going to be presented to the public in the material? Are they going to, or are you going to look to land kind of on one specific number and that's what goes out? Or that kind of is a question I might have all the way through this.
And I think that my response to that is that this as it is my best guess on the right spot, the right size, going to you. Yeah. And then it's kind of you're the next set of eyes to determine yep, we agree with her or we don't, and we think it should be something else because, to even get started. And so the link that I sent out, I can put on our website, and so that will be a
the
resource that would be
available property.
available, yeah, with some caveats and everything because of the BLI and the things that I was mentioning to you. So we'll be exploring whether there's some more visual things, some other tools that we can get to kind of help walk people through the proposed changes and what's there. So I guess that's an option, would be move it forward and have the tool available and see what people think is the right size for that exemption and whether in or out of the, I mean, to some extent, you're probably going to hear feedback no matter what you choose to start with.
Well, I guess as a comment then, quickly, for me, I'm really not sure. And on a lot of this stuff, I've been thinking, gosh, the professionals and the arborists and the developers and everybody who kind of works in this area, it'll be interesting to hear what they think. So when I kind of think about it, I'm, the idea of having some of those choices there is good to sort of hear the information from them or kind of hear their feedback on it. My own personal tendency would be, I keep going back to these objectives, but is to try to kind of maximize canopy, if you will, within the context of the city in terms of efficient development, maybe maximizing development under the other criteria, finding that right balance. So I don't know what that means in terms of 10 or 15 or 20,000 square feet. So I guess I'm kind of fine if you start with a number like this.
Okay.
And I'll say, I played with the map a little bit this afternoon, and there's the shading
Needs
blocks
to be
you from
lightened a
seeing
little bit.
Yeah, it did.
because the yellow, the pieces that pop up, you can't see as soon as you
The 900, especially within the 900
you want the
elevation,
yellow,
it's
you
very
want to be able
dark.
to see the yellow, but you can't because then it goes away. So it's really hard to determine. And I'll be honest, I don't have enough information, in my opinion, to make an argument for why one versus the other. And I think that would be where it'd be really helpful to have, folks who have real life experience and actually have, it's relevant to something that they're trying to do. I think that would be extremely helpful. And for lack of that, I would probably just go with the recommendation that you've provided. And but I would absolutely welcome any other comments on that particular issue. Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I'm a little unsure on this. I would, I might tend toward the 15,000 given small lot sizes and you're still trying to preserve tree canopy and, if you have a 15,000 square foot, I guess our smallest lot size now is what, 2,500 square feet, is that correct?
2,500 square feet for small lots, I believe, and then, 4,500 is kind of the typical minimum for R1.
When you start to get multiple potential lots on a site, it seems to me that you try to preserve, any of those numbers would be more than the single lot. So it seems like maybe 15 would be maybe a better match, given that we have small lot sizes and you could get 6 lots on that medium-sized one. So you would want to try to preserve some tree canopy in that kind of a development. So that would be my, and also, I mean, you're proposing 20, 15, and 10, not 30 or 40. So there's a reason for that, and that's, your maps show that.
Any other comments on that? Commissioner Ramey.
So this was a question I had, and I honestly don't have a great sense of what way to go from this. And I will admit to spending probably an hour looking at that map today because it was so cool. I couldn't really, because of the shading,
I know.
it wasn't
Yeah.
as helpful as I thought. And then I realized at some point, it really would have been helpful to have like 40 and 50, which is ridiculous. But you're kind of see where you are in a context Because my original concern was, well, what if we're wiping out this, like, half of the buildable land? And I don't even have that context. So by the end of the hour, I got back to, no, it's really about the size of the development itself. And I'm starting to get my hands around, well, if I'm right about this, 20,000 is about half an acre, is that right?
Just
So
under.
half an acre, I mean, I understand an acre, that I can picture how big an acre lot, and that's forest land. You know, you can do residential on 1 acre in forest land, so I can understand that. So that's a number I can visualize, and half of that is 20, so that made sense. And then Commissioner Baker's, well, that's 3 lots essentially, no, 4 lots, could be 4. No, it'd have to be, no, it could be 4,
Actually,
right?
it could be 6, but 3 to 6.
3 to 6. So within that, so I'm somewhere, at this point, having said all that and having a wonderful hour looking at the map, I'd still be in favor of putting a real number out and letting people kind of go, oh, too big, too small.
Yep.
And my real number would actually be 20,000. I think it's like half an acre, kind of makes sense to me. But I could easily be 15 as well.
Okay. Well,
I appreciate the other exemptions. I mean, some of my concerns, I think, are addressed by the exemption number 3. So thank you, appreciate that.
We need to vote on that one too.
Yeah, right, exactly. So if we're going to start with the first one, I would definitely lean similar philosophy at under 20. I keep
The 20, okay.
20 and under.
Or 20, yeah, under 20
Under
square feet or less.
19,999.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, 990.
well, let's just go ahead and straw poll it. Those who are comfortable with the
Language as.
language as presented, the 20,000 square feet as a starting point.
And we haven't talked about the South Hills part yet. So we'll
Correct.
talk about
Correct, but we'll just start with the 20,000. So I'm going to go ahead and put my
Commissioner.
vote for that. Commissioner Baker?
Or are we talking about,
I'm just going to do an up or down with the 20,000. That's what we're going to straw poll. So yay or nay on 20,000. I'm not going to provide another option.
okay, I'm in favor of 15, I think.
Okay,
No,
okay.
yours, okay. And then within, maybe an up vote on keeping it as it's written, not applicable within the South Hills area.
Okay. Correct.
Like a negative.
So,
that
All
what you-
lots within the South Hills
Right.
would be subject to these standards regardless of size.
Right.
That's what that says.
Right.
and that's 500 feet up, right?
Yes.
So that seems a little restrictive to me, especially when you're talking about smaller. And there are a lot of those yellow things that are really small. I'm like, well, then
Yeah.
is that even possible at that point? But
And that brings up a good clarification too on that, on the tables that give a count of the lots. Something to keep in mind is that that number is also skewed because there's a lot of odd-shaped little remnant lots and things that are
A lot of those,
counted
too.
as one of the, yeah. So those numbers are definitely bigger than what the reality is. Just, so when you consider those tables, consider that. I guess another little nuance here could be to accept areas at or above 900
I
feet
think that's
instead
where I
of
was
the
gonna
South Hills
throw out
area.
as a
Yes.
possibility was
So
900 feet.
referencing 900 feet or above instead of,
Make a camel here would be kind of.
okay. Is that clear?
So can we do a straw poll
Yeah,
on
let's-
changing that to accept at or above 900 feet elevation, comma, the
Okay.
development site is under 20,000 square feet?
I'm confused there, because we have some other exceptions. We have this 5 or fewer trees.
Which applies everywhere.
So I'm comfortable with leaving it just 500 feet for that reason.
All right, but we're going to straw poll on the 900.
We're going to straw poll on changing it to accept at or above 900 feet development sites under 20,000. Well, we've already addressed the 20,000, so.
Okay, so all those in favor? Or opposed? Okay.
Noted.
Noted, all right.
Then the next thing would be to straw poll on whether or not to include this exemption number 3 for R3, R4, C2, and C3.
I'm in.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you don't have the G0 zone, the G zone,
Oh,
GO zone,
housing that allowed in.
actually
Okay,
100%. Yep.
multifamily and commercial.
thank you. So then to include geo zone as well. Thank you for that.
And so we had conversations, so I feel like I have a little help with understanding this a little bit, but because there are minimum landscaping requirements and parking requirements in many of these zones that kind of accommodate, there are actually requirements that help to create the canopy and
We are
trees
getting
and all of
trees.
that. So I'm comfortable with this. I don't have any problems with that at all. Commissioner Baker?
Well, I'm comfortable with this, but I don't think that these sections provide a canopy. There's some minimum landscape requirements.
Right,
I
but
don't
these
think
are
that's a justification. Justification is that these zones aren't in the areas that were generally of concern. Certainly not above 500 feet, I don't think, so. Well, there may be
Yeah,
some places that are laminate. I don't know if it's above 500 feet or not.
Okay. Anybody else have any?
I mean, but these are more intense land use developments, so I think that they should be exempt from these requirements because of the intensity of land use development. So not because the standards provide canopy, which they do not.
Commissioner Taylor?
I want to add to that actually, because I think a distribution of our urban forests is important. I mean, you saw the slide of Portland versus Eugene, and I actually disagree. I think our code actually in these more intense areas, there are landscape requirements that actually are going to contribute to our urban forests. So I just want to put that on the record.
All right. So straw poll. As proposed, just I'm looking for support up or down and should we add the?
With geo added.
With GO added. Okay. Right, those who support number 3 there? Right. Commissioner Baker? Okay.
So that was 5.
That was 5. No opposed.
Okay, so some of the rest.
By the way, that was brilliant.
Oh,
Just
thank
want
you.
to throw that out there.
Thank you. So the next one, I'm not sure, this is just embedding the adjustment review as being an option and the changes. So I suppose we could do a check-in on the 50% starting point for, oops, sorry.
Right here.
I thought the table was up here.
Table.
Because that was 60 before the first time, and so then I've changed it to 50%, so, and is 50% where we want to start?
Okay. Any discussion?
And that's
It's above
above
900.
900 feet.
Okay.
Right, correct.
So this was the change where we went from the first time, it was 60% with zero mitigation. Now it's 50% with zero mitigation unless adjusted, and you get up to 10%.
Gotcha.
Okay. Are we ready to straw poll presented? Okay. I just never know how to ask. So as proposed, I'm going to just ask for those who support the proposed.
And then just to clarify,
Proposed.
minimum preservation above 900.
Okay. Minimum preservation above 900 going from what we originally discussed, 60 to 50. Those in favor? All right, we've got 5. Great. Okay.
Okay, the next change, whoops.
We're almost at 7, so we're just doing a quick time check. I think we're good, but I just want to
The next section is really more if you want to open it up for discussion or to push back on the, what I reported back on is for, in terms of requiring the common name, genus, and species, or whether we move on for that.
So does anybody have any comments or anything on that? I'm actually, because I feel like it's specific to the accounting method, and I definitely, it sounds like you had consulted with staff, and then there were some compelling reasons that they felt, and I would, I'd love to understand that more, but I certainly, this information came from their recommendations, so I'm comfortable with that, and given that there are obviously options, so is that clear? Commissioner Rainey?
That is clear. I have a question. I'm not sure where it fits in the order of this. And the question is about, is it possible to exempt rights-of-way or utility easements when
Thank
we're
you.
calculating?
I meant to
I don't
address
know
that.
where that fits.
So that's kind of already in here in the sense that that's partly why on the table, why we start with 40% or 50% is kind of acknowledging already that there's an amount of the site that's already going to be devoted to the development. And so it's kind of in there, factored in there. The percentage minimum lot coverage or maximum lot coverage requirement in R1 is 50%. It kind of gets to that a little bit. To specifically exclude rights of way, that gets us into really trying to figure out how we're measuring, how are we determining whether they're in or out, what do we do? From clear and objective, it feels like it would add quite a bit to try to put that into the structure, and I'm not sure that it's necessary, especially given the extra flexibility that's now in here.
The coverage number. Okay.
Yeah, I kind of feel like it would just, my personal opinion is it would add some more complexity to this, which we already were trying to move away from the complex system that we first came up
Well, my
with.
concern is just about a challenging lot that's on a steep slope that has all these other things going on. And they're going to walk away and go, well, there's no way I can develop this because even with the reduction, I can't get there. So, but
I think that the adjustment review criteria will get you quite a bit. The caveat to that is that if it's over 900 feet and only over 900 feet, that might be
that's the one.
where the predicament is, but yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Taylor?
I like this table because where I look at it, because I actually wanted to bring up, and maybe you can, so sorry, I got distracted. Lot coverage, I just want to verify that definition of lot coverage does it include all improvements, including, it doesn't, it's just structures, right?
Lot coverage is the footprint of the structures.
So that's where I'm like, okay, 50%. It isn't apples to apples. So that's why I just want to make sure, because for me, I don't consider it because I thought it was structure. And then the way you said that, I was like, yeah, I think. So anyways, what I like maximum, I like the table the way it is, because if I'm understanding it correctly, you've got a minimum preservation of 40%, maximum mitigation of 50. So essentially your preservation that you're required is 20%.
Correct.
So that's where I start to look at, that's more realistic. So if it was 40% preservation and then 50% preservation, I'd be like, in difficult properties, you've actually put an encumbrance on development that might not be possible. You're forcing into a discretionary process. But when you bring it that, and I do that math, it's like, okay, preservation 50-50, you've got 50 and 25 is preserved. Now it starts to feel a
But
little
above
bit more.
900, you're at 50
Yeah,
With 10%.
between 500 and 900.
on another path.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
But that's
that's
still an
right,
option.
that's right. Yeah,
That's the one.
so I appreciate that, it's helpful.
Okay.
Okay. Where are we?
Where did we
so
go?
we're
Okay, we were
talking about
on the common name. We jumped back to this, but we were on the common name, genus and species. Is everyone okay with us keeping that in, I guess, would be the straw poll.
right.
Proceed with it as written.
Commissioner Taylor?
Yeah, can I just say, this is a really kind of an odd question, and you've talked to arborists, is, I'm always like, I work with surveys a lot. I look at what landscape architects, or arborists, they don't always have three. So that's why I'm like, they don't always have the common name, genus, and species. You know, so I'm just, is there ever a case that they've got a tree and they're like, I know the species, I know the common name, they can't identify a portion of it. Is this kind of, it's basically, I don't see necessarily consistency with the documents that I get necessarily, and it's not so prescriptive, and they haven't been scrutinized because it's enough information. They usually have the common name and they have the species or genus, but they don't usually have all three. Sometimes they might. So I'm just a concern of, do arborists and landscape architects, can they identify that really easily? Or are they standing in front of the tree and they've got this pine from China and they're like, I know it's, you know what I'm saying? So that would be my only concern. And I don't know the answer to that. I just know, and obviously they're going to get consistent. This code section is really clear. And I just want to make sure we check with the professionals. Do you all know, is that information, are you then going to have to spend a whole bunch of money to find out where in China and what exactly that, so anyways.
I'll just say that I have not had that come up where somebody's, had that problem necessarily, but I would welcome feedback on that as we go through, and hopefully,
I'll see if I can.
hopefully we can
gather.
get some
And maybe it's a no-brainer.
landscape architects.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe it's like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
No problem.
Yep.
I just wanted to comment because I've talked to some landscape folks, and a lot of things, they just say cultivar once they know the basic part of it. So it's not really, doesn't really matter after that point. After you have the genus and species, you don't worry about what what
Right.
cultivar it is. It's sort of like, some of the flowers in our yards are,
Variants.
yeah, they don't worry about the third part, which is not the genus and species, but the next.
What's the next one? Genus, species. Yeah, I'm like,
My biology.
I know, right?
So,
I don't even know the common
Thank you.
name for most of
No,
them.
no, I'm talking about the science. What's the next level? But yeah,
All right, so should we straw poll on this?
I'm married to a
Keeping these
biologist. I
things,
just defer to him, right?
because I know that this conversation, when we had this, it was kind of, it seemed a bit cumbersome, but at the same time, it turns out that there is actually a very compelling reason that they need to have this information, if in fact they are doing this accounting method to determine the inventory of the trees, so.
and I appreciate the question of, are we requiring something that's not necessarily needed? And so it did, that's exactly what we want to hear. And we go back and we go, well, is it? And the answer is yes.
So I'm sorry, just Google it really quick. I think that's probably why, usually I see on drawings, common names and species, because the genus, and you've got it in order, it's above the species, so they just leave out the genus. Family is the next one.
Okay.
And that's actually really more where my concern was, and I couldn't remember the hierarchy. So maybe that's why I often don't see three, is that the genus is just missing.
Or the genus.
Genus, because you've got the common name and the species.
Okay.
So the species then infers the genus. So just FYI.
Okay.
And I think it's probably a no-brainer for them.
We could change it to common name or genus and species. I mean,
Yeah.
or wait to see
Anyways.
what we get feedback.
Yeah, exactly. I was just,
Let's wait for feedback.
They might say, you never include the genus without the species, or vice
right.
versa. So, okay.
Okay, so you want to
So we'll straw poll this. So those in favor of, I guess, the language as recommended here, that includes the common name, genus, species, because are we specifically just talking about the
three. Yes, that
three? Okay, let's go ahead and, those in favor. All right, no one opposed, so it's 5.
So moving forward, the next one is just straw poll on this section and the added language on currently. Yeah, the location of all existing and currently proposed development.
And if
Do you
I
have-
might
Oh.
chime in.
Lauren has something.
I would really, I would think it's great if the planning commission could talk about and vote on the concept that Janessa is describing in terms of currently proposed. That may or may not be the wording that you see come back to you. But we will, if that's the concept that you're in favor of, we're talking about what is proposed in this particular clear and objective application, not necessarily all future development on the property. We can come up with wording that gets us to that concept.
Okay.
Thank you for saying that, now that I understand.
Looking at,
Understood.
yes. I
So
think-
currently,
I think
it's not
understood.
what's, like if there's a structure on the site,
It's existing development, so
that's existing,
structures that are already
and
there.
then proposed development that is a part of this application is the same as the word currently here.
Yes.
That's what you're asking us to confirm. Okay, that's, makes sense.
The concept.
She had, like, as Janessa mentioned in the beginning, we haven't had Laura
Yeah.
do a thorough legal review, so.
Right, okay. So everybody's clear on what currently represents, and we're comfortable with.
Little fine tuning on the
Little
language
fine-tuning.
and,
Okay.
but the concept of currently proposed.
So we're voting?
Yes, please.
Sure. Straw poll, currently. Everybody okay with,
Or version N.
or version, a concept that, yes, I'm sorry,
It's getting
my
late. I know. I
brain
feel the
is
same way.
not functioning as
Same way.
well. I apologize, everybody. I had too much sugar today.
Is there anything in the next section that,
Me too.
besides the, is it the?
Okay, wait, now I'm all backwards. What happened?
No, it's
Out of order.
really,
4, 2,
yeah,
3,
part of an occupancy.
5. Okay, so then, oh,
So
Okay.
I assume it's, given your description, is whatever's later, but.
We thought about, yeah. Okay, the next section
ongoing.
is the, right, so the ongoing responsibility of the property owner. Page 5, thank you.
Well, it's actually
Just
4
the,
and 5, the end of.
yes, correct. It's my summary is on the page 5. And so basically, it's this whole section as it's proposed here. There will be, there's a couple other little tweaks to the language that Lauren's identified that we would work through. But for instance, prior to final, or within 1 year from the date of removal, or prior to final occupancy, whichever is later, we just need to add a little bit more clarifying language
Okay.
on that to make it clear. And then we need to double check the citation for the 2014 edition of the nursery stock that we refer to here. So, but in concept, this is this okay? So,
I would also add, in terms of the piece about maintenance of the replacement trees being the ongoing responsibility of the property owner, I want to think a little bit more about that, whether that belongs in an approval criterion or in a condition of approval. So you might, when it comes back to you, you may just see something to that effect in the conditions in the next section, or a few sections down the way.
which it is actually added in here as
is.
well. And so I put it in both places because I wasn't sure if we needed the regulatory in order to have the note, but we can.
So Janessa and I will work on that a little bit. The actual wording may change a little bit as well. But again, kind of, if this is in concept, something that the planning commission is comfortable with, that would be helpful to know. And then anything that comes back to you in kind of the next iteration, if we've made changes from what you've seen, I assume that we will indicate what those changes are for you.
Yes. I know where you're trying to go with this ongoing responsibility to where you're not trying to put a expiration date onto something, so where after 5 years, someone can just say, oh, we can chop it down or whatever. I mean, I understand, but I think that it seems a little bit open-ended. Like, I don't know. That would be my criticism. This is like, if there was a way to quantify what ongoing responsibility would be. I mean, I don't know enough about all of these different species and genus, but some of them probably require a little bit more maintenance than others. I'm just assuming. So if you decide not to water it or something like that, I just want to understand exactly what ongoing responsibility would mean. Do you have to water it? Do you have to prune it? Do you have to, every tree probably has a different way to take care of it, maybe. So anyhow, I know where you're trying to go. I'm comfortable with this. If you can kind of create legal language that would be appropriate, if that makes sense. That's my feedback. Commissioner Ramey.
So I had two questions about this. So the mechanism that requires a property owner to keep the tree alive, where is that?
So, thank you. That's another prompt for, from your email. So let's take a hypothetical subdivision, goes through this, identifies trees to be preserved, trees to be mitigated. Then my team down in the building permit section, get the approved site plan that has all the tree preservation requirements and notes. Then we get a building permit for a lot. And so if that lot is affected by a tree that needs to be preserved or a tree that can be mitigated, then the building permit gets stamped with all the notes that are on here and identifies that we would call out attention to the fact that that's a that mitigation tree needs to be replanted and you need to maintain it. So that's kind of the process as it goes through.
Once they get their certificate of occupancy, then what?
Then it becomes an enforcement issue based on complaint. So if you were in a neighborhood and you were aware that there were tree preservation requirements and you know that your neighbor just cut down a tree in their backyard,
Right.
they can contact us. We have the legal mechanism to enforce it.
Phone in the hotline and say, my neighbor cut their trees down and I know those are protected. Okay.
Yep. So it becomes an enforcement issue after that point to some extent.
Does the city have any mechanism to check that aside from just hearing from neighbors?
It would be really difficult.
It would
to
be
do.
difficult, but that's the mechanism.
That's the
And
mechanism.
the second part of my question was about, this is talking about the maintenance of the mitigated trees. I want to be sure that that's,
The replacement trees.
Now you said protection as well, but I wasn't sure that was the ones that are protected. So there's trees that are existing that are protected, and there's trees that are replacement trees.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to be sure the same mechanisms are in place for both kinds of trees, and that we haven't somehow mistakenly.
So if a tree is to be preserved, that tree should not be removed unless we do have the ability if it's diseased, dead, or dying, or hazardous. Right. So the idea is that that tree remains and lives out its natural life until it fails at some point. But yes.
Two comments. So I just want to clarify, Lauren, Commissioner Edwards' concern is actually kind of addressed by you moving it out of regulation and moving it into a condition of approval to some degree, right? Okay.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and this is not a concept that I've had a lot of time to think about.
Yeah.
And so the question of where does it belong? How is it enforced? What does it mean? All of those things I think are good, important questions. And so my thinking is that in order to kind of keep the process moving, this is something, if the idea of trying to sort of ensure the ongoing health of these replacement trees is important to the Planning Commission, that can be articulated to staff tonight, and we will draft something that we think does that, whether it looks exactly like this or something else, and then we will flag that for you when it comes back around for public hearing, and the public will have an opportunity to comment on it as well. Yeah, I think we can draft something. I'm not exactly sure what it would look like, and I'm not sure it would look like this.
Yeah.
All right. Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, my concern with is when you do draft this, because I've talked to the urban forester quite a bit, the concern is during the first 5 years when these new trees are planted, they need to be watered generally. And so I'm not sure that the word maintenance captures that, because what they talk about is watering for the first 5 years or something. So anyway, you might want to explore that with them, what they suggest would be the best wording for this, even though it gets pulled out of here, so that it does have enough teeth that you could enforce it.
Okay. All right, so do you want a straw poll on this, or do you feel like you have enough clarification?
I think we have enough clarification. Yeah. Thank you.
I know that was funky. All right, so the next,
The next goes into the protection standards, and that was where the big thing here was that I explored the question of whether or not it made sense to add landscape architect or just keep it arborist. So unless you want to discuss whether whether you want to pursue the landscape architect addition at this point, or are okay waiting for clarification from feedback.
knowing what I know from our conversation earlier today, I'll just chime in that I do believe there is a difference, obviously, between a certified arborist. They have a more specialized expertise. There seems to be a reason that has been explained to me to my satisfaction. So I would say I'd be comfortable keeping with what's written here, short of input from the community. And if we hear from a bunch of landscape architects who say we could, do this work, then I might consider being swayed. But at this point, I would certainly go with what you had recommended here. So anyone else have comments on that otherwise? Okay. Should we straw poll that then? All right, so those who are comfortable and supportive of, I'm looking for the language, I apologize.
Where is the language?
It's on
You could
page
just-
8, right?
You
Page
could
eight,
just
I'm on
say
it.
section 4 as proposed.
Okay, section 4 as proposed. Those in favor?
Down here somewhere.
And I can wait.
in favor.
You're okay?
I'm in favor.
Okay. I apologize.
Great. Okay.
So I did want to go back, though. It looked like back on page 7, there was under section 3, you had a 50%. I just made a note that
Oh, thank you.
you wanted to
Yeah.
get some
Yes,
feedback on that.
I did.
Whether 50% was the right number.
Exactly.
Thank you. Yes, this is the starting point on the tree preservation area and the 50% of the DBH.
All right.
I guess the first question would be, is there any does anybody want to propose a different starting point?
I certainly don't have a,
So then maybe straw poll to move forward with the language as proposed.
all right, straw poll, move forward with the language under tree preservation area alternative. Everybody good with a 50? It's a good starting point? Okay, great. Perfect.
Okay, so now do I stop at
The last one is,
the adjustment, the existing adjustment review?
Okay.
So then, let's just move to the adjustment review criteria proposed. This is kind of a housekeeping one, so I don't think we need to straw poll that one. So I don't know if it's worth just proposing in totality to move forward with this section, or if anybody has anything that they feel like they want to propose adjustments to any numbers to start.
no, you're talking about 9.
So this would be
9.8030.
9.8030 subsection 13
Okay. Commissioner Taylor.
and page 10 and 11.
Where I am on this is I honestly haven't had enough time to really get my head into this. I'm just supportive that it's there. And I have to be, it's just similar to what I said earlier. Some of these more complicated sections, I look forward to hearing from the public. And if there's a way, I appreciate your outreaching to professionals. And it sounds like you were able to talk to some certified arborists, and I think also getting that balance with landscape architects. So if we can target, and I know you have done a great job of kind of targeting to make sure at the various sections, getting a diverse opinion from users or from the professionals, I think will be helpful. So these are fairly complex. So just really understanding, have we achieved that balance? And balance also includes, I think Commissioner Ramey brought up that question, and Commissioner Beeson, is that I also looked at the fact that the policing mechanism post-development is based on your neighbor's complaints. So I think there's a level of responsibility for us to look at, have we achieved a balance, assuming there will be no complaints? Meaning, or the complaint, because it's not going to be staff out there driving down the street to make sure that the trees are there. So have we taken into account that we've made a really accurate balance, assuming, there's some things that are going to happen afterwards that might not be reported, if that makes sense. In an ideal world, they're being completely maintained, and I have to be honest, visiting sites and redevelopment, what maintenance and of existing approved situation, it's not a perfect science is really what I'm trying to say, so.
I appreciate that. And I would say this is new language. It's adjustment review criteria. So it's not as critical that it's clear and objective, because this is stepping out, creating another path for the clear and objective for flexibility. But this is a particular section that I would want to hear a lot of feedback on, since it is a fresher one that has had fewer eyes on it, and to kind of get that feedback on whether we're requiring too much to prove the adjustment, whether we're missing some things that we want to ensure that we're getting if we're adjusting. So I'm hopeful that we'll get a lot of input on this too.
Yeah, that's great.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable with the 100% mitigation for the areas in the South Hills study that are above 500 feet. I think it should be more like, you could mitigate half of your requirements, but not all of them. Because again, trying to comply with the implied requirements in the South Hill study, it's for.
Okay, wait, so you're talking about D?
I think he's clarifying that between 500 and 900, he doesn't think it should be 100% option.
Again, because I think, you're changing, you're substituting a 2-inch tree that's maybe 2 or 3 years old for a tree that's 30 to 50 years old to meet the DBH, and it just doesn't seem like a good match in terms of what we were supposed to be, based upon the South Hill study, what they wanted to see. They wanted to see tree canopy. And you're not going to see tree canopy if you can mitigate it all and plant little trees. All you're going to see is buildings for a long period of time.
Yes, but.
Yeah, but there's a lot.
Yeah, so I
Yeah, there's
actually
a lot of.
was in favor of this idea originally, and I think I still am. And Commissioner Baker, I understand entirely what you're talking about, that there will be this 10, 20-year period where you're looking at buildings. But I think that there will be a small amount of that. But I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I'm not saying blanketly, I'm just saying in the South Hills, we define this place, South Hills, above 500 feet or whatever, however we've defined it. I just think it shouldn't be 100%. You should. Well, again, that's my, again, other people may disagree with me. I just think that trading a mature tree for
Right. But just to be clear, it's not 100%. I mean, when you're done, you still have the 50 or whatever the coverage.
No. This allows you to mitigate.
I know, but when you're done, you still get what we want. And you're done in like 20 years.
No.
Right.
No, some species it'll take 30 years, some species will take 50 years.
I don't agree with that.
Well, that's what the arborist told me. It takes 50 years for an oak to get to be 8 inches in diameter at the breast height. And maybe a ponderosa pine or a fir is 30 years. So, to get something comparable to what you're taking out, because we're not worried about, we don't have any requirements for the trees that are smaller than 8-inch DBH. So these are 8-inch or above, right?
So I just want to be clear, we're not talking about 100% clear cutting.
I was gonna say, I think that there's a lot.
No.
I was going to say that part of what made me feel more comfortable with this is that again, we get to apply discretion. We expect that they're showing us that it's the minimum necessary to achieve their proposal. And so we have some ability to push back from if we get, it's not just a pay for an adjustment review and get 100% mitigation. I mean, that's why this section is so long, because I tried to belt and suspenders and try to cover our bases with what are the ways that we can encourage narratives that really give us a justification for adjusting the preservation or mitigation allowances. And so it would be, the 100% was because of the discussion that came on the 27th, and the reality is under the discretionary track, there are times where they can justify not saving a single tree on the site. And so this was to get to a similar level of discretionary review to.
But I don't think that the clear and objective has to get to the same level.
This part isn't clear and objective. This is an adjustment review, so this is not subject to the clear and objective requirement of these criteria do not need to be clear and objective.
Right, but the point is, this is under the clear and objective path.
Only if they opt into it.
Right.
Under clear and objective, they get the 50 for in that area that you're describing. If they don't opt for an adjustment and try to argue a case for a different standard, then under clear and objective and between 5 and 9, under 900 feet, it would be 50% preservation, 25% mitigated, and that's it. So it's only, this
For
is,
adjustment review, then they can mitigate all of it.
yes, but they have to justify it.
Through a discretionary
It's
process.
discretionary.
Right. It just, I don't feel comfortable with that,
Okay.
being that flexible in this, in that, again, because of the Southfield study.
Okay, I
So I have
appreciate
Commissioner
that.
Taylor in the queue.
So I just want to clarify, because actually, subsection A applies to all proposed adjustments. So in order to get to D for 100%, you have to meet all of A.
One of A.
One of A,
So
sorry, not
one,
all, but one.
1, 2, or
1,
3.
2, sorry, thank you for the
Yes,
clarification, I knew it was or.
C.
So you have to demonstrate one of these, maybe meaning cause.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually like the way it's fairly, there's a level of accountability that I think, at least without diving into the details, which I will do, like details meaning create scenarios, kind of, okay, I'm here, what does that look like? Where do I hit some challenges, or does this actually work how we want it to work? I like it. I think basically what my objective, I was one of the people that was talking about this, is those unique circumstances, because I want housing, those unique circumstances that here they are in a clear and objective path, and there's some circumstances that are going to force them out of a clear and objective path because of one element potentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm oversimplifying it right now, but just they can do it, but the site is so cumbersome, and then they're going to be forced out when, so this just allows an out. Now, going back to Commissioner Baker's concern, Commissioner Baker, it allows you out, but you're going to be forced back in if you can't demonstrate compliance with this discretionary process.
Mm-hmm.
So, then you get a choice. You either meet the clear and objective, or you take the full discretionary path and start over.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I will just chime in and say, I think that there are definitely circumstances that I've learned about. An old Christmas tree farm, for example, that was, planted 50 years ago, and it's just a Christmas tree farm, but you can't develop it based on, so to have an option that would, allow for a developer to stay within the clear and objective, but then to just address something like that through this process, I think is perfect. I mean, there's always going to be that one-off scenario that isn't very common, but I think that to have a process that addresses that, I think would be really helpful. So, and that's why I'm comfortable with that number, just knowing that it is certainly a more discretionary process if they enter into the site or the adjustment. So that's my 2 cents, Commissioner.
So, and this is not final.
Yeah, right.
We've said this a number of times. I mean, I think I'm supportive of this. I agree with everything that's been said. I think this is really pretty rigorous. You get to this point to have to be able to comply with all this, to go down this path. And I think what we're trying to do tonight is okay, so we can continue along in a process and get this out so we can begin to hear from people in the community about it. And we'll have another bite at it,
Right.
another shot at it.
Okay.
Certainly.
All right, so would you like a straw poll on just this last section here? Those comfortable with moving forward with the language as proposed, get us to the next phase here, all in favor? All right, those opposed? All right, Commissioner Baker.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears real quick before I hand it over to Alyssa, because I know she has a couple things to go over too. But there is one other item that I need to inform you of. This is not something that needs to be up for discussion. Do we need?
We should make sure we're.
Oh, can we?
Let me
Because
just,
we are at time.
Sorry.
can I just get we need to extend the meeting, I would say 5 minutes?
How much time do you guys need?
I just need a couple, I mean, less than 5.
10-minute extension.
Okay, can we get a vote on if the commission can extend the meeting 10 minutes? 10's okay, okay. You got 10.
Okay, so I'll be
Sorry, you guys.
I'll be super quick. And I don't know if you'll want to chime in on this, but so there was one of the preferred concepts that we moved forward that had support, and that's the regarding emergency response, and it was a criterion that we were going to add to require a letter from the fire marshal's office saying that it complies with the fire code. What we found is that this approach was problematic. We originally kind of got excited about this thinking, oh, this is kind of like our geotechnical letter where, you know, we require a letter and that part in and of itself is clear and objective. The problem is when we really got into it, this is city staff exercising discretion in order to submit the letter, city fire marshal staff. And so city attorney's office really upon reviewing it was not as comfortable with this. And so we made an attempt, this was going on behind the scenes. We made an attempt to work with the fire marshal's office and try to take the fire code requirements that relate to fire apparatus access and water availability. Those are kind of the two things that typically are applicable at the time of a land use application. We did our best to try to see if there was a way to codify in black and white, clear and objective terms, those some of those requirements, and it just kind of boiled down to something that wasn't really feasible or workable, and the fire marshal is able to do modifications and stuff and use their discretion within fire code, and that doesn't work well with clear and objective. So basically we're at a point where we've done everything we could to try to attempt to do clear and objective standards in a way that would work, did not find a workable solution for that. The letter that was proposed is not a workable solution, so we really just need to pull this. COS 08 was the original item number, and so that's just going to need to be kind of in a parking lot for a future fix to address that. But I do want to make it clear that fire code does apply. This has nothing to do with whether or not we can apply fire code or the fire marshal's office has authority or anything like that. So it's just clear and objective turns out not to be the right place to do this. So Lauren, if you want to add anything.
This is more of like an FYI.
This is an informational item.
So when you see it again, the fire marshal letter approval criterion will not be in the draft that comes back to you.
Okay.
And then just moving forward, formal adoption process. So we don't have dates yet. Part of this is going to depend on schedule ability and whatnot. But we're hoping to hold your public hearing sometime this spring and possibly in April, and then move through that as many deliberations as we need to for you to refine the code based on all the feedback you hear. And then you will, at that point, give your formal recommendation of code to count that will go forward to the public hearing before council. And then they'll deliberate based on the public comment that they get. So that's the next steps. And hopefully summer-ish would be nice, maybe fall. Depends on scheduling and everything.
All right. Any questions?
Anything more?
Okay.
I just had a few things I wanted to cover under the items from staff. One, I realized I didn't send you an update about the accessory dwelling unit ordinance being passed by council on January 21st. So they did pass an ordinance that removes owner occupancy requirements and removes parking requirements for accessory dwellings, and those were to be consistent with state law. They did a number of other things as well, removing standards that they determined were not reasonable standards related to siting and design. And then they also they removed some barriers that I think will make an impact on the number of ADUs we see, including removing barriers to above garage ADUs, because based on how the height was set up, that was really not possible to do. And then removing barriers to ADUs on slopes, because of the way the setbacks and the slope setback work, there wasn't enough ceiling height to really get a viable option there. And then they also changed the slope setback. So as it was, or as it is, you come in the 5-foot setback, and then you're limited in height just at that 5-foot line, and then you can go up to the maximum height. And they moved that from 8 feet to 10 feet, which we heard will make a really huge difference in terms of being able to design livable space. And so I think that is also very helpful in terms of seeing more ADUs, which was really the point of the House bill and the Senate bill that drove this. So the owner occupancy and parking are already effective because that state law went into effect January 1st. The rest of the changes become effective February 22nd. It's my birthday. Yay. Happy birthday. You should get an ADU for your birthday. And then I sent you an email today that Planning Commission and Historic Review Board recruitment, along with other boards and commissions, that is open and closes March 1st. Commissioner Baker, it looks like you were the one that you've served 2 terms. And so I don't know if you're planning to re-up. Typically, it's a 2-term, but I don't know that it's a hard and fast limitation. So if you folks know anybody, you're usually our best recruiters. So if you have anybody in mind, please let them know to get their name in. The application's online. And then the online information has when the interviews are. And then just a couple of other upcoming meetings. I just forwarded you information about an open house that's tomorrow related to affordable housing and community development. It's part of the community development division. Eugene and Springfield have to create what's called a consolidated plan related to affordable housing. And so they're having their open house tomorrow, late afternoon at World Pies. I know that there's been a lot of talk here about housing and affordable housing, so that's one way you can touch in on that. Your next Planning Commission meeting is the 24th, and that will be on River Road Santa Clara update. Then you have a public hearing on March 3rd, and this is on it's a code amendment related to downtown Riverfront. I know you just went through a giant package on that, but in the development of the park, they realized that there are pieces about the park that contradict each other. One says you can have a pavilion, and the other one says there's a view corridor and you can't have any development there. So they're just bringing that into alignment. We sent out a poll for you about upcoming. We don't have an appeal; it's just a potential appeal, and so we'll throw some dates on the calendar. Again, we'll let you know if those become real. And the other thing, although it doesn't have any impact on you immediately, other than maybe you're just curious, is that the 2020 legislative session is underway. There are a handful of bills related to land use. Probably the one getting the most attention is House Bill 4001, and that's the one that would require us to allow a shelter, an emergency shelter anywhere in any zone, regardless of what our land use code would say. So that one's getting a lot of attention. There's a couple related to urban growth boundaries and having pilot programs to expand the urban growth boundary for affordable housing. And then there's just there's some that don't necessarily have any verbiage to them yet. They're just related to land use and require DLCD to study, but sometimes those become other things, so we're just keeping an eye on those as well. So those are all my updates.
Just a question, is the March 3rd, is that 5:30 in here?
I think that one might be over in Harris Hall because we're anticipating that this room will be under construction, but we'll keep you posted on that. Because I think notice may have to, I'll let you know.
Okay. All right, anything else for the good of the order? All right, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn the meeting.